Hello, this is Robert Reinl, along with my fellow Elders for Climate Justice, Steve, Judd, Lance, and Stuart. And we're very happy to be with Ken Kimmell today. Ken Kimmell's had a distinguished career. He spent over 30 years working to improve environmental issues, particularly in the area of clean energy and mitigating climate change. A lot of work in the transportation field. Before his current role as president of the Union of Concerned Scientists, he was the Commissioner of Environmental Protection in the state of Massachusetts, in which he had responsibility for a $400 million budget and 1,900 employees. In that role, one of his major accomplishments was also to be the chair of the Regional Commission to reduce greenhouse emissions of the 9 states up in the Northeast, in which he was able to get that group to commit to a 50% reduction of emissions and resulting in about a 900 million ton reduction. So he's got a great career, and Ken, we are thrilled and delighted to have the opportunity to talk with you today and ask you some questions and see if you can enlighten us and the people we'll be sharing this video with.
Well, thank you, Robert, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this. I'm looking forward to having a conversation with you.
So I will start with the first question and then hand it off in sequence to my fellow team members. The first question is the issue around where we are with renewables now and how we're going to get to where we need to be. It seems that while we're all excited about renewables, currently they make up a relatively small amount of the contribution for the world's energy needs. And the question really is, how do we get from here to there in the time frame that we really need to? There seems to be an urgent need to move. Every day that we have more and more, coal and oil and gas being used instead of renewables, it gets harder to do something about. So what is your recommendation, particularly given the very, very huge influence that the fossil fuel industries have on our government and governments around the world?
Sure. Well, that's, in some ways the $64,000 question. I'm going to give sort of the good news part of that question and the challenging part of that question, try to address both, because I want to give that important question, its entire flavor. The good news is that if you and I were talking about climate change 10 years ago, and you asked me, how are we actually going to decarbonize our electric sector, say? I would say I'm not really sure. The technologies are not really there yet, but I think it's going to be wind and solar, but I can't really prove it to you right now. So fast forward 10 years, I think we now have the technologies with wind and solar and energy storage and a few other things around the horizon. So at least we're not having conversation now about whether some technology exists. Now this conversation is mostly about political will. So I just want to note that that's a significant improvement in things. I also want to suggest that, I saw a couple weeks ago a picture of the Macy's Day Parade in New York in 1903. Maybe you guys have seen this. And it was all horse and buggies with one car. Then a photo was taken 10 years later, same location, same day, all cars, one horse and buggy. And the question that I saw in this lecture was, did all those people in 1903 realize that they were on this verge of this incredible disruption, and did they see this happening? And the answer was no, that no one saw this happening. And I want to throw out the possibility that that's about right where we are now with renewables, that the shift could happen a lot faster than we think because of the technology improvements and the drop in costs and all of that. But so that's the glass half full part of the answer, is that in the recent years we've made tremendous progress in improving the technology, lowering the cost, and we might be on the cusp of a very much more rapid transformation. But I'm not willing to bet the bank on that at all. So I think it's absolutely critical that we continue to push hard on the policy tools that we know work. So some of those include, at the federal level, tax incentives for renewables. One of the things I'm very concerned about as we speak is the tax bills that are being floated around in DC, which actually go the opposite direction in taking away some of the incentives for renewables while maintaining the subsidies that are still in place for oil and gas and coal. So that's a really big problem right now that we've got to work on. At the state level, we really know how to accelerate the incentives for renewables. We have renewable portfolio standards in 28 states. Those can be tightened and made stricter and higher percentages of renewables required. And we can do that without it being costly because these technologies are dropping. So that's another way. We can also do what we've done here in New England to grow the offshore wind industry, which is to require utilities to enter into long-term contracts for those types of facilities. The reason that's important is that big, heavy capital investments in something like offshore wind need a guaranteed revenue stream. And those long-term contracting requirements essentially use the balance sheet of the utility companies to allow investors to provide capital for these projects to get built. So all of those things work. So those are some things government can do. Of course, there's also the whole issue of carbon pricing, which maybe we'll take up in a different question, but that's another thing we could do to help with renewables. I would also say, though, that another trend that I like is the way many businesses are starting to lead by example and put their money where their mouth is and purchase directly ever larger quantities of renewable energy. I think that's a real opportunity, and as consumers of these products, we have the opportunity to influence these companies and let them know that we care a lot about where they get their energy from to do their work. And similarly with both states and local governments, we can pressure them to be purchasing renewable energy. So in answer to your question, there's the technologies are there. They may be headed towards a situation where they're going to rapidly take over in ways that we can't even predict right now, but I'm not willing to bet on that. And so I would like to see at the corporate, state, federal, and local level a concerted effort to accelerate the transition.
Thanks very much. We'll move to Judd and your question.
Yeah, hi Ken. This is Judd. You alluded a moment ago to carbon pricing. So I've got a question about a carbon tax. It seems like many people think that a carbon tax is one of the most efficient and effective ways of reducing carbon dioxide in the air. There seem to be three basic versions of a carbon tax. One is a cap and trade, kind of like California adopted. The second is just a straight carbon tax on the price of carbon. And the third is a carbon fee plus dividend, which is being pushed by people like the Citizens Climate Lobby. So do you have any thoughts on those in general or each of them in turn?
Sure. Well, first of all, I should say UCS supports carbon pricing in all of its different forms. And I personally do. So whether it's a cap and trade or a carbon tax or a carbon fee and dividend, they all do accomplish something really, really important, which is to put a price on carbon so that the fossil fuel energy actually includes in the price the cost and that it's causing, the externalities that it's inflicting, the problems of climate change. So we support all of those, and the differences between them are real, but they're much smaller than the differences between having carbon pricing and no carbon pricing at all. So in a nutshell, the differences are this, that if you have a cap and trade program, the government establishes the overall amount of carbon emissions by setting a cap. And typically that cap declines over time. And then it leaves up to the marketplace to figure out what the cost of that will be. A carbon tax is the opposite. The government establishes the cost through whatever the tax is and leaves it up to the marketplace to determine how much reduction to get. So both can work. If I were the czar and I could just pick one without regard to politics, I would pick the cap and trade, because I think it's really important to know how much reduction we're getting and to be sure about that. But some people feel that a carbon tax is more straightforward and more politically palatable. And in those jurisdictions, I'm fine with that too. Now, the final question you asked is, what do you do with the proceeds? Because whether it's a cap and trade program or a carbon tax, it's going to raise revenue. And you can give all the money back to people. That's the fee and dividend approach. Or you can keep some or all of the proceeds. I am in favor of the government retaining at least some of the proceeds and reinvesting that revenue in activities which themselves further the purpose of the taxation or the cap and invest. So for example, in the Reggie states, Richard, Robert mentioned in my biography, we have a cap and trade program here in the Northeast, and we auctioned off the allowances to the power plants that gave them the right to pollute. But we didn't return all of those revenues to people. Rather, what we did is we invested heavily in energy efficiency, and we made our New England states the most energy efficient states in the country. And that was a public investment that I think has paid off in spades. So I'm in favor of using at least some of the proceeds for activities that further mitigate climate change emissions. And in many jurisdictions, it turns out that's more politically resonant to people than just getting a dividend check back, because a lot of people say, well, what's the point of paying it if I'm just getting it back? What does this actually accomplish? And so I think that's something to keep in mind. Final point to make is there are some jurisdictions where a revenue neutrality is a political plus. And so the Citizens Climate Lobby feels that way. At a national level, they may be right. Certainly, James Baker and George Shultz and a lot of very smart people from sort of the Republican establishment believe that if we're ever going to get to national carbon pricing, it's going to need to be a revenue neutral proposal which gives the money back. So I guess an answer is these are all good. They all have different pros and cons. And in certain regions, some will be more politically viable than others.
Thank you, Ken. I'm going to turn you over now to Lance Polia, who will ask you the next question.
Okay.
Hi, Ken. Obviously, there's a great deal of polarization in this country over climate change. You mentioned before about it being largely a partisan issue, which is dividing both parties. Do you see a way we can bridge this divide? Are there ways elders in particular can help with this? And for instance, Jim Hansen had an argument of appealing to grandparents speaking up for the future of their grandchildren comes to mind. So are there ways to bridge this divide, and can elders help with this?
It's a great question. I think there are ways to bridge the divide. One thing that's good to just keep in mind, climate change is by no means the only thing we're polarized on right now. So we're not uniquely polarized on it. We're also polarized on gun control and healthcare and a great many issues. Climate change, unfortunately, is one of them. So I can tell you a little bit about what we at UCS are trying to do to overcome the polarization. There's no silver bullet here, but we have found that different things work for different audiences. So one thing that we do a lot of is to try to connect climate change to things that people are actually experiencing in their daily life. So as an example, over the summer, we released a report on rising seas, which attempted to define the time period by which a community would find that it's essentially permanently inundated. So 10% of its space would be inundated, 2 weeks a month. And to try to, and so we mapped this all out. We have an interactive web tool that allows people to plug in their own zip code and see what's going to happen to their own property and their own neighborhoods. And we made it a very direct connection. So it's not something that's so abstract. And we didn't even really get into, exactly what the causes of sea level rise are. We tried to, it's not that we're trying to hide that story, but people are waking up every day, particularly in coastal communities, and seeing that their communities are starting to flood even when there's no rain. And so tracing out what that's going to mean for people and making the point that these communities have a limited amount of time to prepare for this is really a very good bipartisan motivator. And what we've seen as a result of that work is that, especially along the coast, we see both Republican and Democratic congressmen now starting to talk about climate change. They've formed something called the Climate Solutions Caucus, which is like a Noah's Ark type of organization. If you're a Democrat and you want to join, you have to find a Republican to join with you, and vice versa. And now there's 60 members of that caucus in the House of Representatives, and they're starting to flex their muscles. So one of the things that does work is to make the impacts very real and very personal and not so political. So that's one. A second is to try to point out that doing something about climate change doesn't mean socialism. Doesn't necessarily even mean big government. We were just talking about carbon pricing. That could be a very non-big governmental way of dealing with climate change. It doesn't necessarily involve people paying higher taxes or giving up certain things that they want or having the government tell them what to do. So that works, is to separate the solution from the cause. And then the other element is to try to tie climate change to other concepts that people understand. And one of the ones we talk about a lot is the idea of insurance. All of us, have insurance on our homes. We don't actually think that our homes are going to burn down, but we're not willing to take that risk. And we're willing to invest something now to make sure that if that were to happen, we would be compensated. And so that's a concept that people can understand, and you're not forcing them to accept your view of the science. You're just saying, think about it like this. And then the final one is to emphasize the benefits of dealing with climate, the jobs that are created in the new clean energy economy, the air that gets cleaner when we're not burning coal for power, and those types of things. So all of those things can work. They do work. And as citizens, I would encourage you to try all of those different things. Also good to remember, though, at the end of the day, there are going to be a significant number of people that we're not going to persuade. Perhaps as much as 30 to 35% of the public is not really going to believe in climate science or want to do anything about it. And that's not the goal, to get 100% consensus. I think the goal is to get all the people who have already accepted the science of climate change to raise the issue in terms of the level of urgency which they give it. So instead of the 9th most important issue, the 2nd or 3rd or the 1st most important issue. And then there's about 10% of the people who are truly on the fence, and we'd like to get them in the camp. But that's the goal. Raise the level of urgency for those who already accepted and get about 10% more of the people in. And groups like yours, citizen groups, are very important in that overall goal.
Thank you, Ken. That was a very comprehensive answer. So we're going to do
probably too comprehensive.
No. So now we're going to move to Steve Simmer, please.
Yes. Hi, Ken. I'm Steve Simmer. As I've been contemplating this interview with you, I've been thinking about a paradox that I can't quite figure out. That the scientific method has been the cause of significant cultural change over the last couple centuries. But here we are around this climate change issue where there's significant skepticism about science. And I'd be curious about your speculations about what's going on with this sudden skepticism about the scientific method and the findings of science when we are all the beneficiaries of such significant technological advance?
Well, again, I would, that is one of the biggest challenges we face. And of course, just to contextualize it a bit, it's not just skepticism about climate science. There's skepticism about all manner of things, and so much fake news and so much disinformation. We've invested quite a bit of resources in messaging research and focus groups, trying to understand this better, because the dilemma here is a sizable number of people seem to not accept scientific truths that have been very well substantiated and laid out. Yet those same people are incredibly eager to seize upon and believe as if they're true beyond doubt the most bizarre kind of unsubstantiated conspiracy theories about things. So, my classic example is the person who doesn't believe that climate science is real, but thinks that Hillary Clinton was operating, a child sex scandal out of the basement of a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. So it's pretty hard to get your arms around that. So we've done a lot of focus groups, and here's generally what we think we learned is that despite the rap, most people actually are in awe of science and have incredibly reverential feelings about it. They associate it with medical devices that have made their lives better. They associate it with these incredible photographs we get from the rings of Saturn and, amazing things like that. They associate science and innovation with economic prosperity. So they actually, it's not that they've lost respect for science as a whole, but what has happened is they are very skeptical of experts, people who purport to be experts, and question their motives. They wonder who's paying for them. They often don't believe that scientists are actually objective. They think that they have an agenda. And unfortunately, here's where I think this comes from. I think this comes from years and years and years, unfortunately, of industry scientists pulling the wool over people's eyes on so many things. And people have kind of had it, and they don't trust scientists anymore, and they feel that way, and government scientists have to own up to this too. They feel that way about government scientists too. So they really distinguish science from scientists, and getting the credibility back is a really major challenge. Something that we're working quite hard on.
Right, I can imagine. So I'm curious, just to let us get behind the Wizard of Oz's, curtain here. How you proceed with this skepticism about the scientific method, given what you've told us? What's your strategy in terms of countering this?
Well, we have a number of them. A part of it is to link the values of independent, objective science to things in people's everyday lives that matter. So, for example, we're in a big battle right now, of course, over government regulation. And I think the opponents of government regulation have done a marvelous job linking it to job loss and productivity loss. We have to do a much better job linking these safeguards to actual benefits to people's health, and making sure they understand what it means to have safeguards that keep their water clean and their air clean. And so getting into the specifics and relating it to things that people can understand is really important. The other thing is to point out that unfortunately, many industries have a long history of obfuscating and denial and suppression of information. So, for example, a couple of weeks ago, we just put out something called the Disinformation Playbook. And it shows We have 5 different plays: the fake, the blitz, the screen. I can't remember them all. They're all sort of football plays. And we show across industries how all these different industries, from tobacco to asbestos to oil to sugar, all use these plays. And then accompanying that is a video of an NFL player who gave up a huge contract with the San Francisco 49ers because he learned about all the research linking playing football to brain damage. And he kind of just got in front of the camera and said, I wasn't willing to put my life through that. And thank goodness for this independent science, because if it hadn't been done, I never would have even known about this, because the NFL wasn't about to tell me. So it's those kind of really personal stories that connect independent, objective science to things that Americans care about is the way to go. And it's hard work, but I don't see any other shortcut.
Thank you, Ken. I'd like to turn you over to Stu Kennedy, our next team member.
Stu, thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it. Given the current situation at the federal government level, many are now looking to the states, the cities, businesses, and the citizens, all of us, to meet the climate change challenge. Actually, this is the central theme of Bloomberg and Pope's recent book, Climate of Hope. You've made some comments already in your answers today that indicate things that can be done at the local levels and the state levels and among the businesses. The question here is, are those enough? Is having the big elephant in the room, the federal government, so looking at every opportunity to advance coal and advance the current industries, are we going to be able to overcome that?
Yeah. So there's a ton that states and cities and universities and businesses can do. Many of them are doing it. I was very heartened, and Mayor Bloomberg deserves some of the credit for literally the day Trump proposed pulling out of Paris, there was a chorus of people lined up to say, well, that's Donald Trump's opinion, but as far as I'm concerned, we're still in this agreement. That was very, very powerful. And I think it really helped reassure a very anxious world. And I think the proof that will be in the pudding is whether these states really step up their level of ambition to compensate for the federal void. I think they will be partially successful. I think there are ways that they can do more than what they're already doing, but they're about 1/3 to 40% of the American economy. And so it's somewhat not naive isn't the right word. It's unduly optimistic to think that, roughly 1/3 to 40% of the country can make up if all the other states are not joining in and doing anything. And so some of the rollbacks that Trump has proposed, would slow down progress. There's no question about it. Like the Clean Power Plan, that was designed to get states to cut emissions from power plants. Now, some states are going to do better than that federal law requires, but some states were not on track to meet it, and now they're being let off the hook. So that's going to have an effect. You also noted something else that's really important. It's not just that the Trump administration is going AWOL on climate change and not doing anything about it. It's that the agenda is actually to affirmatively promote the very sectors of the economy that are causing the problem. So, you've probably heard about this directive to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to come up with a way of subsidizing coal plants, which would interfere with the marketplace and interfere with that. Another one we're quite concerned about is, what is Mr. Trump going to do with this question of solar tariffs? You may have heard that 2 American manufacturers are claiming that China is unfairly, or the whole world is unfairly competing with them. And Mr. Trump now has the ability to put tariffs on other countries' solar panels, which could raise the cost of solar here and slow that down. And then the third one, we talked about in the beginning, this tax bill is incredibly one-sided from an energy perspective by keeping the deductions and tax loopholes for the oil and gas industry, but weakening them for the renewable industry. So it's going to be hard enough for the states to make up for the government, federal government just being neutral. But if now it has to take on the government actively promoting the dirty industries going in the wrong direction, I think it's a little unduly hopeful to think that we're going to make up all of that difference.
Thank you, Ken. That's a really good answer.
So I love Bloomberg and Pope, and I want to believe that they've got it, but I think it's more optimistic than it should be.
Thank you. That's a good comprehensive answer and doesn't surprise me, and it shows us that we're on the right track in trying to push the movement forward, and certainly your great organization is. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll hand back over to Robert.
Yes. So Ken, first of all, let me point out to our viewers, I'd strongly encourage you to go on to the UCS website. It's www.ucsusa.org. And there's a tremendous amount of great information, a lot of great staff doing terrific work. And Ken's pieces, including a number of his podcasts, are available to kind of continue to get deeper on these things. And with that, Ken, just again, thanking you so much for sharing some time, this kind of time with us. It's been wonderful. Any final points that you'd like to share with us as we sign off here?
Well, I guess I'd just like to congratulate you for having an organization of this nature. And, you know, you're in a position where you have some wisdom and experience in life and maybe some time to put into these important causes. And I'm just really heartened that your group exists and that you have this thirst for information. And I think there's a lot that you can offer.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank
My
you.
pleasure. Good to talk to you all.
Next week.
Okay, bye-bye.
All right.